Thank you for giving us a wonderful showing. My name is Nicole Austin Hillary, and I'm the Director and Counsel of the Washington office of the Brennan Center for Justice. For those of you who are not as familiar with the Brennan Center, we are a national legal advocacy, think tank, research, strategic communications organization. We are headquartered in New York, and we have a Washington office here that helps to oversee all of our policy and advocacy work. We are an organization that likes to do what we call fix those broken parts of our systems of justice and democracy. And we do that through those prongs of research, litigation, advocacy, and strategic communications. Many of the issues that we focus on range from voting rights to campaign finance reform to fair courts to liberty and national security, and to one of our very big issue areas, which you all are here to talk with us about today, which is the justice system. Our justice program, which is headed by my colleague Inamai Chettiar, whom you will hear from a little bit later this morning, focuses on ending mass incarceration. So everything that we do as part of that justice program work is all towards the goal of helping to end mass incarceration. So we are very pleased to have this discussion this morning with our friends at New America and to talk about the politics of criminal justice. I think we all in this room know that we are at a very important moment. Everyone in the country is now talking about criminal justice, not just about criminal justice in general, but how we as a country, regardless of politics, regardless of how you think about these issues, that we all recognize that we have a crisis in this country of mass incarceration, and that it's up to all of us to try to work together to figure out how we resolve these issues and how we move our democracy forward despite this crisis. One of the things that is going to make that possible is the nexus between and the collaboration between those on the left and the right. And that's part of what we're going to be talking about today, and that's work that we are very proud to be engaged in here at the Brennan Center. One of the things that we recently took part in and helped to spearhead was the creation of and the publication of a book called The Solutions Book, which is a compilation of essays by many of the individuals who are presidential candidates, either presumed or declared, as well as other thought leaders around the country, including our panelist this morning, Mark Levin. And these individuals compiled essays that talk about what they think needs to be done to help reform our criminal justice system. It is a groundbreaking piece of work because for the first time, it really brings together people from various spectrums to talk about what they all think we need to do to help resolve our criminal justice problems in the United States. And that's part of what we'll be talking about this morning. So we're excited to have you here and excited to be involved in that conversation. I also lastly want to tell you about a report that the Brennan Center is just releasing today. It is entitled Reducing Racial and Ethnic Disparities in Jails. One of the things that we recognized at the Brennan Center through working with a blue ribbon panel of experts that included Mark Levin, Inamai Chettiar, myself, and other criminal justice experts from around the country is that so much of the problems that exist in our criminal justice system are exhibited in our jails. We know that there are problems at the federal level, but we also know that so many people are incarcerated at the state levels, and that what happens and what we need to focus on in order to try to fix these problems really needs to be centered on what happens in jails. So this report, which you can get a copy of if you see our Vice President of Communications, Janine Plant-Churlin, who is here in the front. If you can see her after the program, she has copies. But this report is groundbreaking in that it talks about what is happening in our jails and what we can do to help reform what is happening in these jails and how that can be a foundation for, again, working to solve this issue of ending mass incarceration. We are pleased, very pleased, that Commissioner Anthony Batts of the City of Baltimore wrote the foreword for this groundbreaking report. We are also doubly pleased that he has decided to join us this morning for this conversation. Anthony Batts was appointed police commissioner of the City of Baltimore, Maryland in September of 2012, and he commands the 8th largest police agency in the United States. He has over 3 decades of law enforcement experience and previously served as chief of police of two of California's largest police agencies. He began his career in law enforcement in 1982 as a police officer working street patrol and narcotics, and has worked his way clearly based on that experience up through leadership ranks in the criminal justice system. He was recruited to serve as chief of police for the Oakland Police Department from October 2009 to November 2011, where he developed a long-range strategic plan for that agency while helping to oversee a $170 million budget and help to improve community outreach. And I think as you hear from him, you will understand, and when you read his foreword, that so much of that foundational work that he did then informs the work that he does today, and is a reason why he has been around the table working with the Brennan Center and other organizations to help figure out how we deal with ending racial disparities, how we deal with this long-ranging issue of mass incarceration. So without further ado, before you hear from our panelists, I'd like to ask Commissioner Batts to join me here, and he will give us a few opening remarks, and then we will turn the panel over to our panelists. Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity for me to come and say a couple words in a very succinct fashion. I applaud the Brennan Center for being on the cutting edge and challenging our belief systems and our values for change. What I share with people often is that I grew up in South Central Los Angeles, a very poor child in an impoverished environment with a lot of dysfunctionality, prostitution, drugs, etc. A lot of the things that young kids unfortunately have to deal with in this world today. I reflect on the fact of asking my mother, does anybody care whether I live or die? Does anyone care about a person who looks like me, a young kid who is seen to be, oxymoronic statement, invisible to the world? Did anybody care if I lived or if I died? As I grew, I became a police chief of a major police agency within the United States, the city of Long Beach. And in my second or third year of being chief of police, I sat there one night about 11 or 12 o'clock at night, patting myself on the back of leading this organization into large numbers of arrests and dropping of crime rates. And at that time, we were doing those methods because the community said, do something. We're being plagued by drive-by shootings. We've been plagued by rock cocaine. We've been plagued by the drugs of our community. But as I sat there as an African-American chief of police of a major city who grew up in those types of communities, I took a real deep look, and I looked at the people that we were making arrests on. And I started to project out on how we were decimating communities. Years later, I reflect on, or years earlier, I reflect on the Rodney King era where the city of Los Angeles had a major riot. And when you think about it, that riot did not start with that moment. It started 10 to 15 years prior. When I reflect, when I went to Oakland, and they had a Meserly trial that led me up there, where Oakland led into riots. I reflect on being in Baltimore over the last 45 to 60 days, where we dealt with a major riot. When you go back and you look at the rationale and the reasons for some of these things, they didn't occur at that moment. That was the event that broke the camel's back. But if you look back, it was 10 or 15 years prior. How does mass arrest play into that? Well, a young officer came into my office recently and said, Commissioner, I remember reflecting back in the early 2000s where we were doing mass arrests within the city. And we were just clear corners because corners had drug abuse taking place in drug cells. What we didn't know is when we rounded up many of those African-American males that turned out to be, is that these kids weren't all involved in drug sales. Some of them had athletic scholarships. And a number of them lost their athletic scholarships. And much like when I sat there and I mused myself, I said, what were the impacts that we did to those cities? What you saw in the last 60 days is a byproduct of some of the things that had taken place in a bygone era with some of the police tactics that we did of mass arrests. Today, we do hotspot policing, and maybe in 10 years, we'll look back and say we didn't do all the right things then either. But I applaud the Brennan Center for taking on the challenges to make us think outside the box, to challenge our values. And for us in the police, we stand between the left and we stand between the right. But for the leadership in law enforcement today, our job is to look forward and to challenge our value systems. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Commissioner. Now I would just like to briefly introduce our moderator for this morning's panel, Heather Hurlbert. Heather is a friend to the Brennan Center, and we are so pleased that she is moderating this morning's panel. Heather is the director of the New Models for Policy Change program at New America. She leads research into how policy advocacy is adapting to be effective in our current environment of intense political polarization and provide guidance to advocates and funders seeking to navigate politics effectively on behalf of policy solutions. We are pleased to have Heather with us this morning, and again, you will see that she is extremely knowledgeable about these issues, so we couldn't have a better partner to help lead today's discussion. So without further ado, Heather, thank you.
Thank you, Nicole, and thank you so much to the Brennan Center for being our host this morning in this beautiful facility. I'm going to move as quickly as possible to let you hear from our very knowledgeable panelists, but just a little background on why we're here. As Commissioner Batts said, we have a big problem in this country and a problem that defies political categorization or easy political answers. What we do in the political reform program at New America is look at what are ways, without reforming the Constitution, without changing how we elect officials, what can we do right now to make our political system more effective at addressing problems that people like Commissioner Batts, who are on the front lines, are coming to us and saying, look, this is a problem that we as a society, not we as liberals or conservatives, have got to do something about. And of course, where we are right now on criminal justice reform is, as Nicole said, a very exciting moment, but it's also a moment of real transition as we move into a political election season, and where you have these remarkable, unusual relationships that we're going to hear more about this morning, and we see how do they hold up? Do they hold up in the face of partisan political pressures, which, by the way, did a lot to create the tactics that Commissioner Batts referred to that seemed like they were the right thing to do at the time, but in retrospect maybe didn't work so well. I'm going to quickly introduce my three panelists, which I won't do justice to, so I encourage you to learn more about them. Immediately to my left, your right, is Jamelle Bouie, who is a staff writer at Slate, formerly at the American Prospect, the Daily Beast, very widely published, and takes a really interesting lens that incorporates both national politics, campaign trail politics, but also deep dives into policy and racial justice in the US. Next to him, Inamai Chettiar, who is responsible for the Big Book of Solutions that you just heard about. She directs the justice program here, came to it from the ACLU, from a long career working in this field, and where she also dipped into politics by being Bill de Blasio's transition director for these issues up in New York. And farthest to my left, I set this all up just so I could say Mark Levin is farthest to my left, is Mark Levin, who is the founder of Right on Crime, which is a Texas public policy institution which in that, for many of us in the DC area fantasize about ideas moving politics. Mark Levin is actually doing that by putting together both the ideas and the political heft to make criminal justice reform a genuinely conservative enterprise. And you'll hear from him, among other things, how the state of Texas became a national leader in those issues, which is maybe not something we in Washington are used to thinking of. I should make one last comment about Mark and his work that my colleague Steve Tellis, who is here hiding somewhere in the crowd, yes, waving his hand, you'll see him referenced in the New Yorker this week, and he and David Dagan have a forthcoming book looking in some detail with Mark and others about how we got, how Mark did what he did and how Texas did what it did and how that led all of us to be sitting in the room today. So speaking of which, Jamelle, I will start with you. We have a number of bills in front of Congress right now getting at different aspects of criminal justice reform. There's another one being dropped this afternoon by Representatives Sensenbrenner and Scott that really tries to be more comprehensive, actually, and take on a number of the issues that Inamai and Mark and others have been pointing out. What chance do any of those have of going anywhere this year? Are we actually going to see federal action, or just all this excitement is going to dissipate away?
It's really interesting because the cynical side of me says that Washington or Congress is so polarized along partisan lines that even if you have these coalitions of lawmakers, both in the House and the Senate, working together on these items, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to make their way out of committee, make their way onto the floor, make their way to a final bill that gets voted on and the president can sign. On the other end, the process of passing laws can actually be quite long. And the fact that there's this cooperation happening now, the fact that these coalitions are being now, doesn't guarantee that something happens next month or next year, but maybe if we have a Republican president in 2017 and the Republican primary process has kind of made criminal justice reform a salient issue for everyone involved, then all of a sudden the groundwork is there for immediate action in that first 100 days. Or if we have a Democratic president in 2017, which is just a polite way of saying if Hillary Clinton's president in 2017. I really hate the fiction that you have to pretend like that's not like what we mean by that. If that's the case in 2017, then likewise, maybe it might be a little more difficult because you won't have that unified partisan control of Congress. But again, you have these coalitions being built right now around concrete pieces of legislation right now. And even if those particular pieces of legislation don't ever make their way to being voted on, it is certainly true that they can become the groundwork for other pieces of legislation and other sort of compromises and legislative activity. So I'm actually optimistic about this, in large part because I tend to take a bit of a longer view with legislation. It's not going to happen now or next year or even 4 years from now, but the process is beginning and that's vital.
So you're saying don't see this as a sprint to early 2016,
Right.
but rather see the various bills that are percolating now as stepping stones for something later. Speaking of 2016 presidential contenders, you spent a bunch of time doing a deep dive into what they all think. I have to say, I find anything where you have to do that much research on that many people fairly challenging. Is Jamel right to think that you could actually see a Republican primary and a Democratic non-primary as reinforcing momentum toward criminal justice reform, or instead are you likely to see sort of a return to partisan rhetoric on crime that actually drains away momentum from what we're seeing?
So I think it's possible that there might be a return to partisan rhetoric, but I actually am more of an optimist on it. Just from putting this book together, it really seems that there is a bipartisan consensus from everyone from Scott Walker to Hillary Clinton that we do need to reduce the size of our prison population. I think that the question among them is how to do that and at what to what extent, right? So you could probably get agreement on reducing prison sentences for very low-level drug possession, but are we going to get to reducing longer mandatory minimums for violent crimes, or are we going to get to removing 3 strikes? So I think it's how far people are willing to go. I think the other thing to watch is whether this issue increases in prominence. So right now, the presidential candidates are talking about it, but it's not among the top 2 or 3 issues. And so I think the question is how to get it up to that level.
Although, do you actually want to get it up to that level, or will getting that up to that level actually produce more of the blowback you don't want?
So I think that there is a division among advocates about which way to go, right? So when a lot of this was happening at the state level, some people thought that it was better to keep it behind closed doors, inside baseball with state legislators and not have it turn into a national issue. But I think that now that it has turned into a national issue, the more that it increases in prominence, the better it will be, because there actually is a consensus there.
Mark Levin, what's your view on what the right tactic is at the state level now?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think I just came back from Germany where I was touring prisons and with a great group, several corrections leaders in the United States. There's some excellent stories on the Marshall Project that you can read that have photos and really highlight the difference between the 2 systems. But I asked one of the professors there, what is Angela Merkel's view on prisons in Germany? And he said basically she doesn't care. Not in the sense that she doesn't care what goes on there, but it's not an issue. And, of course, they have 10 times fewer people per capita in prison than we do, far different conditions that are much more humane and rehabilitative. But the reality is, you take an issue at the state level like child welfare. kids in foster care and things, you don't really see a difference between the parties as far as I can tell. You don't see the issue really politicized either. And so I'd like to think we could get there in this area as well. And you look at polls of the American people, crime is 18 out of 20. And I think that's because crime's been declining for 2 decades. We're not where we were in the mid-90s when it was on kind of the front burner. So I think we're in better shape now, and that there's the space to have this discussion without hysteria about rising crime rates. But I would say that it's kind of a balance. In other words, with the kind of justice reinvestment and other reforms in the states, it's not been kept a secret. But on the other hand, it's not on the local TV news either, but there are stories about it. There are speeches by legislators about it. But the big difference at the state level is you have to pass a budget. Things have to get done in a limited calendar. In Texas, is 135 days every 2 years, and many people say they should meet 2 days every 135 years. But in DC, things can draw out a long time. But I'm optimistic that the stars are aligned now. For one thing, you look at the Senate, a lot of the Republicans are going to be up in states that are very close in this next election, with a bigger voting block, of course, in a presidential year. So I think that the stars are aligned to have something happen very soon.
And to add to that, precisely because crime is so low salient for the general public, in the 90s and in the 80s, you had sort of a negative cycle of partisan polarization, right? Republican says, I'm tough on crime. Democrat says, no, I'm tougher on crime. Republican says, I'll have 20 death penalty offenses. Democrat says, I will literally personally kill an inmate. Now, because crime is so low salience, and because we have an election year and the Republican Party on the national level is trying to make gains with a whole different segments of voters, and like you mentioned, you have Republican senators in blue states running for re-election in a presidential year. All of a sudden, there's a potential for a positive cycle of partisanship as they try to outdo each other for reform in order to get those votes, in order to make those connections. And that, when that happens, it can be actually very, very good for pushing an issue forward.
Yeah, and I'll give you an example. John Kasich called me, this was a few months before the election, against Ted Strickland. And Strickland had set up the justice reinvestment process in Ohio, was very supportive, and it never came up in the campaign, but he was calling and saying, when I become governor, can you come up to Ohio and help me with this? And of course we did, and we worked with the Buckeye Institute, our counterpart there, and he helped bring a couple of last Republican senators over the line. And by the way, one of the challenges is in states that don't have term limits, when you get somebody who's elected in the 90s by saying, I'm going to be tough on crime and my opponent's soft on crime, getting that kind of the mind retrained is a challenge. But we, of course, Ohio passed a huge bill with sentencing reform, as well as a bill that said people could get occupational licenses who are ex-offenders, which we've done in Texas. And Kasich ended up getting like about 30% of the black vote, which was just unprecedented for a Republican. And he talked about this issue with black churches in Cleveland and so forth. So I don't think he started out to do this because of anything political, and it wasn't an issue in the campaign. Both candidates agreed on it. But certainly it's a big change when you now have Nathan Deal in Georgia setting out a campaign mailer on reducing incarceration versus in the 90s, as you said, it was who can be more punitive than the next guy.
So maybe it's because I was working for the Clintons in the 90s that I have a certain degree of skepticism about this. Maybe I'm just unreconstructed. But you mentioned Scott Walker, and I wanted to dwell on him because there's been some writing suggesting that he's the outlier, and that he actually, there hasn't been the kind of movement in Wisconsin that there has been in other states, and that he's spouted a lot more of the sort of tough on crime rhetoric that we're used to hearing. But you locate him within the consensus, so talk a little bit about that.
Sure. So I would encourage people to take a look at his essay in the book, which is new material. And so it's I think, a stronger statement on criminal justice reform than before. I would locate him in the consensus, but probably further to the, I don't know which side, further to the end of, not at quite as progressive on the issue of reducing mass incarceration. But he does talk about how the need to reduce drug crime and how that is possible without necessitating mass incarceration, which I do think locates him in the consensus. I think the question is, he might not want to go as far as some of the other candidates. So
Mark, I'm going to ask you a question that's going to sound flip, but is really serious. which is, has Donald Trump called you yet?
No, and I've been waiting for Bernie Sanders to call too, but maybe you could ask de Blasio to ask him to call. No, but we're obviously we don't get involved in campaigns, but we're happy to provide information to anyone, regardless of what side of the spectrum they're on. I have no idea what he thinks about criminal justice matters. But yeah, I think that, with some of these things, we're dealing with people who said or did things in the 90s in that day and age. And I mean, I do think policymakers have a right to change their mind, just like the average citizen does. But it is helpful when they explain, okay, here's why. And, look, there's been a lot of new evidence coming out about the effectiveness of alternatives to incarceration, the fact that we've reached a certain point with incarceration we've gone way beyond it, really, when you get any benefit. And in fact, you get more benefit by spending the money on policing or prevention or probation or treatment. And, you even have new treatment technologies. You have new non-narcotic treatments for heroin, for example. So, it's fair for elected officials to say, look, here's why I've changed my view on some of these things.
So, Inamai, take us through a little bit what sort of, if there's a light option and then a medium option and then a sort of your fantasy reform scenario, and where you see the political dialogue landing. You referred to this a little bit, but dig in some more detail.
Sure. So I guess the light option is curtailing some parts of the incarceration system. So maybe reducing imprisonment for technical violations of parole or probation, reducing sentences for low-level drug possession, things like perhaps drug courts. So I would see that as kind of the light option. The heavy option is actually laid out in the Brennan Center essay in this book, which is to eliminate the use of prison for low-level nonviolent offenses except in exceptional circumstances, and to across the board reduce sentences so that they're more proportional to the crimes committed. And I think that if we did that, we would have a system that both reduced crime and reduced recidivism and incarceration. The medium option, I think, is a lot of what some of the states have done, as Mark has mentioned. So I would say a lot of states have introduced not necessarily comprehensive reform, but reform that attacks different parts of the system at the same time, increasing reentry programs, again, the reduction of the parole and probation violation reincarcerations, and reducing some sentencing on the front end. So where is the political consensus going to land? I think it will likely land on reducing some mandatory minimums, probably not as extensive as we would like it, as well as reducing incarceration for some low-level nonviolent crimes.
So I'll ask each of you, what's the next step in building left-right consensus on what I'll call a heavier option? I mean, which we all understand is politically more difficult, but what's the next thing that happens either in the state level or at the national level to make it more possible to keep a coalition moving toward a heavy option?
Yeah, I think it's not a single thing, it's a combination of things. First, sort of general conditions around crime have to kind of remain on trend, right? So if there's a sudden spike in violent crime over the course of 2 years, and I think this will all of a sudden collapse because you'll have a political incentive again to be tough on crime. So if violent crime continues to decline, if the push towards drug legalization and drug decriminalization continues, I think you'll see that the space will stay where it is and continue to open up. Past that, it's one of those things where even with someone like Scott Walker, if he's on sort of the status quo end of the consensus, as long as no one is sort of like trying to jump outside of it, as long as you have people on both parties pushing towards the heavier solutions, I think you expand the bounds of possibility. Not now, but 5 or 10 years from now. 10 years from now, if you had said that, to use a
a non-criminal justice example. 10 years ago, same-sex marriage equality was just like not on the national agenda, and now it is. And that happened in part because of these small movements of politicians, of broad social change, but also of politicians kind of taking small and gradual steps towards endorsing marriage equality. And for the general public to see that those steps weren't leading to disaster or sort of radical change, right? So if Congress passes a federal bill sort of lessening punishments for nonviolent drug offenses, and it's widely publicized, and a year passes, and nothing's gotten worse, and all of a sudden you can push it a bit further, and that requires political courage. The lights got dark. Oh Lord. That requires political courage. That requires activist pushing, public intellectuals, activists, journalists, everyone sort of working on the idea end to continually put these ideas into the mainstream. But if all these things are kind of working in concert, then I do think over the long haul you can get to a point where sort of serious, heavy reform is on the table.
Yeah, I mean, I think that part of it is building consensus around the principle that we should have the least restrictive alternative in responding to crime, the least amount of kind of infringement on liberty necessary to protect public safety. And so obviously that's kind of very consistent with the ideas of limited government and individual liberty. And when you apply that to across the criminal justice system, you see, for example, people are detained pre-trial before they've even been convicted, many times simply because they can't afford bail, sometimes for marijuana possession and other nonviolent offenses. And then obviously there's a whole range of issues which we really haven't gotten into involving conditions of confinement. We just saw that fellow in Louisiana who was in solitary confinement for 40 years and apparently didn't even commit the offense he was convicted of. And these are areas where I think, again, you can say from the standpoint of limited government, we've gone way overboard. And so I think that it's a philosophical shift that we're seeing. And in our view, when you simply apply conservative principles, and again, there's people who may talk about it on the other side in the context of social justice and things, but I think what's most important is to remember that regardless of what side you're on the spectrum, this is not just a fiscal issue. Sometimes people think all we're focused on is saving money, but some of the strongest voices have actually been social conservatives, concerned with keeping families together, concerned with the idea of redemption, which is in every major religion. Fortunately, we've seen as some state budgets have bounced back and even had surpluses since the 2008 recession, that nonetheless the trend towards at least mild reductions in incarceration has continued in states around the country. So I think that's a very hopeful sign. And the reality is each of our groups on different sides of the spectrum kind of continue to work in that area. But we also, of course, as you all know, have the Coalition for Public Safety, which has come together and I think has kind of brought some firepower to the broad consensus and actually put forth some specific goals. And I think that sometimes people say, well, does it hurt us with our base or whatever to be working with groups on the left? Well, I think people are smarter than that. They know that there are still some differences, but that there's nothing wrong with having a dialogue and being able to unite where the areas that are in common.
So I have to say this question of does it hurt us with our base is one that I think needs a little more digging into, especially as now that you've had Secretary Clinton come out and make a speech that nodded at least to the big principles here. And at what point, not during a primary season, but at what point in the general does it get to be a problem that, both parties' bases are now very energized, sort of against anything that Jeb Bush would say or anything that Hillary Clinton would say? And is there a risk that some of these ideas get identified with one or the other and thus are poison to both? Or have we really, in looking at public opinion on these issues, have we really moved past that?
I think I still sort of land on the position that this is all tied to crime reduction and lower salience of crime in public opinion. I just can't imagine. I honestly, I can get pretty cynical about national politics, and I can't actually imagine a scenario in which, say, it's September 2016, and Hillary Clinton gives a speech on criminal justice reform, and Marco Rubio gives a speech on criminal justice reform, and Democratic people in the Democratic base would say, well, now I guess I'm against that, especially given the Democratic base essentially consists of African Americans. African Americans. I just don't see that happening. On the other end, I don't see conservative base voters responding, especially if their nominee is speaking about the same issues. I don't see them responding by saying, well, obviously these ideas are bunk. That the fact that even high information voters who tend to be the most polarized voters base their positions in part on sort of partisan affiliation, and if only one party were talking about this, then I think polarization is a real possibility, because it's just what happens when one party is focused on an issue, it becomes centered around that party. But with both parties talking about it, with conservatives and liberals embracing criminal justice reform, there's sort of no place right now for polarization. That might change. There may be subordinate issues, thornier ones on which you do see polarization. My hunch is that if there's ever a push to begin rethinking how we sentence violent criminals, you might see that happen there, because it's much trickier and thornier and contentious. But on these concerns involving nonviolent offenders, involving drug crimes, sort of the low-hanging fruit and the figs you have to reach for a bit. I don't see polarization happening. I just can't imagine the scenario.
So I largely agree with that. I think that once the conservatives came out strong on this, and then Bill and Hillary Clinton joined, it's now politically safe.
Right.
And so one thing that I've been waiting for is where the mainstream, or when the mainstream Democrats are going to weigh in on this, right? So we have Hillary Clinton, but where's Elizabeth Warren? Where are other folks that are leaders of the Democratic Party? And I think that's starting to happen now that Hillary's spoken out about it. But yeah, I think that the direction is moving. My only scenario where I see polarization, I think that as some of this bleeds into what's been happening in terms of policing and race, there is a tendency for it to become more polarized. So that's where I don't fully understand why, but that's where I see that it could turn into an issue that people either want to stay away from or becomes more divisive.
Yeah, Mark, I was actually trying to think of the way to address to you exactly the question that Inmai just raised. As we go through a period where the headlines are dominated by instances of interaction with the criminal justice system that are very racially charged, and we know that people see in very racially driven ways. What do we experience? And I also want to say you're an identified conservative, but I have to say it's my belief that the divide here is racial rather than ideological, and that you have white Democrats respond in similar ways to white Republicans. So what are you seeing at the state level in terms of whether recent headlines and coverage of Baltimore, or in a different way of Charleston, are affecting how people respond when you say criminal justice reform?
Sure. Well, I mean, and there is certainly, I think, people do distinguish between policing, which is largely a local issue, and incarceration, which is state issue first and foremost. And so, but there certainly is a relationship. The good, one of the interesting things is the polls have shown over the last several years, even before Ferguson and Baltimore and Charleston, people thought crime was going up, a slight majority of people, even though it's been going down for 20 years. So it's actually good in the sense that now maybe they really think crime's going up, but they still have the same favorable opinions. I mean, we've done polls on drug sentencing reform and adjusting property offense thresholds for inflation, which we just did in Texas, mandatory minimums for drug offenses and things, and you get 70 or 80% support among Republicans as well. But, you know, I do think that, you know, the racial issue is a very complicated one, and I will tell you that, you know, one of the things that, you know, we try to do, just as an example, you know, certainly when you have hotspot policing, which is something we've, you know, been a fan of, you know, obviously the results in New York City, you know, speak for themselves over the last couple of decades, but undoubtedly that means that in African American areas, because they tend to have higher rates of crime, and particularly violent crime in some of the inner city areas, that if, you know, someone who has drugs, okay, they're a lot more likely to be arrested if they're in that area than if they're in an area that may be mostly white and you know, higher socioeconomic income. So then when you, so you have to then say, and then obviously look at when somebody is, well, not even arrested, because in New York they're handling some of the marijuana cases with death citations, for example. So you have to then, in the response to the particular incident, make sure that that is proportionate and again, the least restrictive approach. So we would say the answer isn't to, just because there's some disparity in the numbers, to not provide the type of policing that in some areas need more policing than others, but to provide a different type of policing. One of the great models is the David Kennedy's work, which basically you have these call-ins and you actually get the neighborhood on the side of the police, and with a particular focus on reducing open air drug dealing rather than saying, okay, you know, because again, we recognize people may use drugs in their home or whatever, and you know, that's not something we want, but what we really want to do is prevent the shootings that are associated with some of the turf wars and these drug markets. And so that program, it's been in Boston, in High Point, North Carolina, Cincinnati, it's had great results. And so there are models of policing that work with neighborhoods. And then you look at something like Ferguson, an average of 3 warrants per household, mostly for minor traffic violations. Why not create a way where people can voluntarily come forward, do community service if they can't afford to pay the fines, and just get that off their record? Because you want people reporting violent crimes. And if they've got warrants for traffic violations, they're not going to report crimes. They're not going to be a witness. They may not even come forward when they're a victim. So we've got to be smarter about how we do this. And obviously the policies that we've got in place that are overly punitive and so forth have had a disproportionate impact in certain areas. But at the same time, we have to recognize that in terms of prevention and policing, these areas need more attention, but it's a different type of attention than we've given in the past.
Jamel, do you have thoughts on sort of how current events and policing, I mean, do you agree with Mark that the public really does differentiate between policing on the one hand and incarceration on the other?
I'm not sure. Actually, I tend to. I don't know, because I'm not sure what the polling on this is. I'm not sure what the data necessarily is. I know that over the last year, there have been some surveys to suggest that the broader public, and specifically the white public, is more likely to say that policing is unfair than it was, basically pre-Ferguson. There's like a Ferguson divide, and that I think that suggests that these issues are sort of tangled up, and there's the public is not necessarily differentiating them entirely. That there are causal links in their mind. Whether or not I think your suggestion that there's a possibility for polarization as a result of these incidents is there. I think one reason it may not have happened yet, despite the fact that these, you know, Baltimore and Ferguson and all these have been very heated, is the new presence of video evidence. I do think that the presence of video evidence has sort of begun to change the automatic response of people to these incidents, right? So, you know, maybe 15 years ago, it might be easier to say, well, the police are probably just doing their job. But if you see something like the Walter Scott video, or this morning, because I apparently like to have sad mornings, I started watching Fruitvale Station. And Fruitvale Station, I don't know why I decided to do it, but I was like, oh, it's on Netflix, I should not watch it, but here we go. But that opens with the shooting of Oscar Grant, right? And if you see that video, what it looks like it looks kind of like an execution. the wide presence of those videos, I think, slowly begin to just shift people's orientation towards how they interpret these events. And so whereas someone might have reflexively said, oh, the police were just doing their jobs, now they might say, well, wait a sec, what's happening here? And that reaction, I think, depolarizes things along racial lines a bit, which can change. So much polarization, I think, depends on whether or not political actors decide to go for it. If you wanted to demagogue around race, you could, and you could find success. And the fact that political figures, or mainstream political figures, are making an active choice not to do that, I think, most dramatically the past week with the Confederate flag in South Carolina and other southern states, there was an opportunity there for a conservative politician or even a white Southern Democrat,
If only there were a white Southern Democrat.
if it still existed, to demagogue on that issue. And politicians have made a conscious choice not to, and that depolarizes things. And so as long as that's...
You're not being fair on Jim Webb. I mean, he did try.
I mean, but who's listening to Jim Webb besides political journalists?
So, Mark, I want to ask you, and then have these two comment one more time, and then we'll take some questions from the audience. But, the point that Inamai made about sort of how an issue position becomes accepted by both sides, and how the interesting moment that you've had now, a lot of national Republicans speak out on this, and you've had Hillary Clinton, and Dick Durbin deserves a lot of credit on this, but that you haven't seen, perhaps in part because we're not having a very contested primary. But talk a little bit about the part of this process that we in Washington don't see, which is really what we've been looking at New America and what Steve and David's book will address. But the work at the local level of making it safe for political figures to take on an issue like this. And how does it get to a point that a Newt Gingrich and a Marco Rubio and a Jeb Bush feel comfortable taking on these issues?
Sure. Well, one of the great things is we have all these states that have enacted significant reforms, whether it's Georgia, Texas, Ohio, South Dakota. And, I can't think of a single example of anyone losing their job over it, anyone losing an election because they sponsored a bill to reduce criminal penalties on nonviolent offenders or whatever it may be. So that's, I think, very reassuring for other policymakers looking at becoming champions on this. And certainly the idea, we've actually worked in some blue states too, where we've had, a governor or whomever who's on the left say, look, I really want to, even though, we're in the majority, I want this to be, bipartisan. And it's kind of like if two people are holding hands on the diving board, the water looks a lot warmer beneath. And that's kind of what we've seen. And again, I think the results matter too. Actually, if you look at over the last several years, Pew's done this research, the states that have reduced incarceration have had crime go down more than those that haven't. So actually being able to document that, as we have in Texas, obviously, that crime's gone down double-digit percentage, at the same time our incarceration rate's gone down double-digit percentage, that continues to reinforce. And of course, it goes back to what you were saying, is we are somewhat vulnerable, obviously, to a spike in crime. And obviously there have been, I think, obviously Baltimore's seen a spike recently since the events there. New York's gone from 10 murders a month to 12 or 14 or something, but these things are so isolated. And again, I think once some of the efforts bear fruit to repair some of the damage that's been done from some of these incidents, that you will see that change. But the reality is a lot of what has brought about some of the reduction in crime is demographic, and those trends are continuing to take place. So I don't see any, there's been some speculation about a crime wave, but there's really no evidence for that. It's very isolated to specific areas. But by the same token, I think we have to look at the long haul, and even if crime went up 0.5%, this year or something, still compared to where we were 20 years ago, it's pretty amazing to see the drop in crime that's occurred.
Does either of you want to weigh in a little bit about how this looks from Washington, sort of watching this ripple effect approach national politicians?
I think that what's happening here is very similar to what has played out in the states. And so I think that as states have kind of been laboratories of this, experiment of reducing prison populations while crime continues to go down, that it's then kind of trickled up to Washington. I guess I still see a very strong role for the federal government in all of this. I know that a lot of these reforms do need to take place on the state and local level, but to the extent that leaders in Washington are leading the country on this, I think that we will see more reform happening in states.
I was intrigued to notice that just yesterday, the governor of Virginia announced the formation of a panel to study the question of whether sentences were too long. Which,
You have to bring back parole, and it's really interesting because a bunch of states abolished parole in the 90s, and I'm not aware of any of them that have brought it back. Thankfully, there haven't been any new ones to abolish it in recent years. But it's, I think it's a great opportunity, and hopefully that they will, because it's part of the thing of creating an incentive for inmates to complete programs and good behavior, and just recognizing also that there's a lot of, in Texas and other states, you see a lot of disparities across the state in sentencing patterns, and the parole board is able to even out some of that.
And I'll add Virginia, I think, is an example of how the lack of sort of, I just call it demagoguing on crime, can open up space in both parties, right? Bob McDonnell, whatever you think of Bob McDonnell, it is unquestionably a fact that he made criminal justice reform a priority in his administration, especially in the last 2 years. And while it did not necessarily pay political fruit, it did kind of take the issue off the table for partisan attack. And so Terry McAuliffe, I think, has been much slower on this than I would have liked. But the fact that a very cautious politician like McAuliffe is moving forward with this is a sign that in the state of Virginia, I think in large part to Bob McDonnell, criminal justice reform is now something that can be discussed without anyone sort of worrying about having to protect their flanks from attack. And that, even if Washington doesn't move legislatively on criminal justice issues, as long as national politicians aren't trying to scare each other over crime, and as long as national politicians are speaking in favor of it, I think that just creates political conditions around the country for moving forward on the state level. I really don't think you can overstate how important it is that no one is trying to demagogue.
I'm just struck, actually, how McAuliffe in particular combines both the state trends that you talk about, and that I think he may be the first example of what you're suggesting, Inamai, that then there's sort of a reverse effect where both, because of Virginia's proximity to DC, and frankly, because if you're Terry McAuliffe, once your former patrons and close friends, the Clintons, have come out in favor of it, that sort of gives you that extra little bit of cover, which is interesting. So let's take some questions from the audience, and we've got mics, so please wait until the mic comes to you. Tell us your name and affiliation, and then actually the rule is it has to be a question. So a short question, and we'll start with the gentleman in the shirt that looks purple to me, and then followed by the woman over here with glasses. Yeah.
Hi. My name is Michael. I'm a grad student at Johns Hopkins. I have a question about kind of looking at the state level on all this. One thing that a lot of legislators have to deal with is the reality of the American Legislative Exchange Council, also known as ALEC, and some of their prominent members have been the private prison industry. I'm curious if you can kind of address the reality of private prisons at the state level, sort of the incentive that they might have to pass more stringent laws that kind of counteract this movement. And I also have read that some of this is actually kind of scaling back in some states. So I wondered if maybe you guys could take that on.
Sure. Well, I'm actually on the Justice Performance Task Force at ALEC, so I'm probably a good person to answer that. But, whatever y'all may think about ALEC in terms of other issue areas, we, over the last, 4 or 5 years, and Jerry Madden, who's a senior fellow with us and the former chair of the Texas House Corrections Committee, he chaired this ALEC task force. But, literally, sentencing reform, collateral consequences reform, such as, enabling people to get an occupational license despite having a conviction, problem-solving courts, victim offender mediation. All these things have been passed as model ALEC policies. Incentive funding, so counties and other local entities can, if they send fewer people to state prisons, they can get a share of the savings for programs that reduce recidivism. So all these things have passed as ALEC model policies. There was, I guess, probably up until 3 or 4 years ago, there was someone from one of the private prison companies who was a member but didn't vote or introduce model policies, but they pulled out. So I'm not aware that currently there's not any private prison groups involved in the task force. I think the broader question, though, is a fair one, and that is, certainly there are a whole range of individuals and entities that essentially make money off of the correctional system. And of course, some of that may be good if they're providing a product or service, whether it's drug treatment that's effective. And of course, a lot of these entities are nonprofits, certainly not private prisons, but a lot of the treatment programs are nonprofits and so forth. And then you've also got drug makers who make medications for mental illness or certain addictions. And then you have electronic monitoring companies. And so none of this is good or bad, inherently. The question is, how do you implement it? And certainly in contracts with whether it's nonprofits or for-profits, there need to be strict performance measures. There needs to be transparency so people can get open records. And if possible, to have it be based on performance, on reducing recidivism. And that's really what they're doing in Great Britain. They have $100 million in a fund that goes, for example, they have a nonprofit that works with inmates on reentry, and they only get money to the extent they reduce recidivism. They get zero if they don't reduce recidivism. And of course, you've seen New York and Massachusetts move forward with social impact bonds. We prefer to call it, performance-based funding or results-based funding, because bonds really scare politicians because this isn't going into debt for the state. So I think it's important to change the terminology around that. But the basic idea is that we're shifting the risk to the private sector, and so their compensation for providing whatever intervention it is based to, in these cases, entirely based on reducing ultimately the cost to the state by reducing recidivism. So I think that's, and then when you look at something like electronic monitoring, for example, you want to make sure you're using it on offenders that have a significant risk of flight or where you need to make sure they're in a work program or whatever it is, but you don't want to just blindly put everybody on probation on electronic monitoring. It's very expensive, for one thing, and of course, a lot of times the probationer themselves has to pay it, but that creates a lot of problems, as many of them can't afford it. So these things have to be used. You have to match the right intervention with the right offender, and a lot of that is using risk and needs assessment, and the decision certainly should not be based on who's making money off of it, but it's not a bad thing to use the private sector, whether it's nonprofit or for-profit, but we've got to make sure that these things are done based on evidence, and so that there aren't sweetheart deals and things like that. So that's, when I was in Germany, I was struck by how many private providers they had providing services in the prisons as well as to probation. So it's not something that, it's just a matter of doing it right, and there could be good government prisons or good bad private prisons. Unfortunately, most of them are bad, whether they're government or privately operated. And one of the problems we've seen with some of the contracts with private prisons is they require everything down to the lock and key mechanism to be the exact same as the government prison. So there really is no room for innovation. There may be savings because you don't have pensions and things like that. But what we really need to focus on is having fewer prisons of any type and trying to encourage innovation in alternatives to incarceration. And the private sector, whether it's nonprofit or for-profit, can be an asset, but again, it has to be done with transparency and based on performance. So that's where we would stand on that.
Does either of you want to jump in on the private?
Sure. So I think that what Mark is getting at, the problem inherently isn't necessarily with private prisons, it's with the way that financial incentives are structured for prisons generally. So regardless of whether they're public or private, they're making more money based on, their budgets increase depending on how many people are in prison. So the solution there is to change the financial incentives so that they're being paid based on reducing recidivism, public and private, and that's the real way to reduce our prison population.
Thanks. So the woman here.
Hello, Sharon Bovat, Voice of a Moderate. I'm a new media journalist who was jailed 3 times in Tennessee on trumped-up charges because I blogged about political and court corruption. I've learned that a lot of journalists in certain states are basically run out of town. I learned in the court system that sentencing, I met a woman who admitted that her black nephew committed a crime, but the white person that did the exact same crime with her nephew got 1 year, her nephew got 5 years. I've gotten copies of contracts.
Can you give us a question,
My
please?
question is that there was a Tennessee legislature signed an agreement to have a 90% occupancy rate for the paid for the for-profit prisons. My question is that, should that be illegal? What can be done about that? Do we really, and then with the racial incentive, how do we monitor it? Can there be a database created so we know why these people are getting the different sentences? What can be done to fix this? Thank you.
Oh, yeah, let me address there was a really good question about the occupancy rates. I'm staying at the Marriott. They would like the guarantee as well. But, that audit, that's totally wrong. And I will tell you, in Texas, we've got like 10% of the inmates are in private prisons, and our Department of Criminal Justice insisted that they own the prisons. And the contracts say if we don't need the prison anymore, they can back up a Mack truck and take the inmates away tomorrow. And thankfully, we've closed 3 prisons. 2 of them have been private prisons. But it really didn't matter. The point was, let's close the ones that have the highest capital costs, that are in areas that need to be redeveloped, that have inadequate facility space, and so forth. But the state needs to keep the leverage and also to have competition so these things can be rebid. And unfortunately, when you do something like that, you totally eliminate your flexibility and competition. But I was also struck by your question about media access and so forth. One of the interesting things was in Germany, sometimes the inmates, they're able to call the media and talk about the conditions there, and they do so. And I think that's quite interesting. We need a whole lot more transparency in terms of our prisons and criminal justice programs in general.
On the question of where a person goes to look for data on racial disparity in sentencing, and can either of you suggest resources?
I think that data is very hard to find. There are some states that collect that data. There are places like the Sentencing Project that have reports on that data. But generally speaking, the documentation of how race plays out in the criminal justice system is lacking.
So I know we are on a hard deadline because our friends at NYU have another event. So we're going to take 3 last questions and then let the panel close out. So we'll take Steve Tellis here, the gentleman in glasses. And then the woman with the long hair, and again, your jacket looks sort of purple. Yeah, you. The person who's looking behind her to see if it's someone else. Yeah.
All right, so.
And then the woman over here in the black jacket and pearls.
Okay, so just to be helpful, I'll be really quick. So this person over here was mentioning ALEC, and they hadn't gotten the memo that ALEC's changed over the last few years. What about prosecutors? If I was actually thinking about the organizations who are still fairly retrograde on these issues, prosecutors are, and they have a lot of power, and what can we say about whether or not they're going to continue to have power, whether or not they've essentially been rolled over in the last few years, or whether it's imaginable that they could be, that their power could get weakened even further, which would make it easier to make new waves of reforms.
Great. So prosecutors, and then we'll take the 3 questions together. So yeah, go ahead and ask yours while yeah, you go ahead.
I'm interested in the fact that so many people go back to prison within 6 months. Are the politicians focusing at all, or would they, on the need for reentry programs, effective reentry programs?
Great.
Hi. So when you all brought up the idea of like incentivizing to reduce recidivism, it kind of brought up the idea of the whole issue of incentivizing schools to get test scores and things like that, and how that's a mess too. So how do we, even with the incentivizing for reducing recidivism, how do we stop the foolery with that also and really make change?
I'm so glad you asked that, actually. When, Mark, you said that, I was sitting there thinking, and then how would you mess with recidivism numbers? So that is a great question. Mm-hmm. So recidivism, reentry, and prosecutors. Jamel, we'll start with you.
So on prosecutors, I think this might be one of those cases where the solution is just to beat them. I think often in politics, there are times when you can't necessarily convince or co-opt, you just have to build a larger coalition and kind of create more power on your side. And I don't know if prosecutors groups, if private prison unions, prison guard unions will ever be partners here. And so the goal then is not to make them partners, but to just have more people on your side and to win. And winning creates victories, and the more victories you have, the more space, the more your opponents begin to see that maybe it's time to loosen up a bit. No one likes to be shut out, and that I think is your great advantage. I'll say just real quickly on recidivism and sort of how can we avoid juking the system. The thing about education and school testing is that it's still quite nebulous, right? We're still not entirely sure what it means to have a good teacher or what progress looks like for students. I admittedly am not an expert here. It seems like we would have a pretty good sense of whether or not there's a person in a jail or not, and if they were there before. And the fact that that's fairly concrete, I think, is a built-in limit to how much stat alteration you can have, as opposed to test scores for third graders, which you could essentially make up and no one would know.
So on the prosecutors issue, I actually think that there is a growing voice among prosecutors and actually police heads, so law enforcement generally, that we can reduce incarceration while reducing crime. So I think that voice is increasingly playing out. So we actually, a couple months ago, released a report on reforming federal prosecution and had several U.S. attorneys participating. And so I think that there is a shift happening among prosecutors. I think a lot of prosecutors likely already agreed that we had to reduce incarceration, and now it's, I think, a little bit more safe for them to say that. So that's that point. And then on the how to measure recidivism, I mean, this is something that comes up frequently where I guess there's no perfect success measure. There's no perfect way to measure what we want to achieve in the criminal justice system. But what we know is that the way that it's being measured now is like the most horrible way possible. So number of arrests, number of prison beds, number of prosecutions, number of convictions, like all of that is like the most backward way possible to measure success. So even if the way that, if you were to measure recidivism, of course you can doctor numbers, of course you can do all these things, but that measure of success is tremendously better and taking us in the right direction compared to I would call them the volume-based metrics that we have now.
Yeah, actually the two questions are linked because I think one of the most frustrating things in terms of being a district attorney or other prosecutor is you don't really have a good feedback mechanism. You send somebody off to prison or you send them off to an alternative program. How do you know a year or two later or 3 years later what the outcome of that is? And fortunately, we have some research that's shown, for example, for low-level drug offenders, that if they go to a drug court 3 years down the line, there's a lot less recidivism than if you sent them to prison, which would be usually for a year or less anyway. In fact, these short prison terms are particularly destructive because the loss in terms of connections to employment, family, church, etc., is far greater than any incapacitation effect. And of course, with people with just a drug problem, we really shouldn't be focused on incapacitation anyway. So part of it is getting into the hands of prosecutors some data that they could use to follow up and see what the outcomes are and to change how their office is run. There's DA's offices that have used, conviction percentage as a performance measurement, and even some that have used how many people go to get a prison sentence. And so they need to completely shift to a recidivism mindset, and there's many that are interested in doing that. And so we, in California, you saw George Gascon, who's the DA in San Francisco, granted, but he supported Proposition 47. But we have in Harris County in Houston, Texas, a conservative prosecutor, Devin Anderson. We went on a trip with her to Seattle to see the law enforcement assisted diversion program, the LEAD program, which actually police never bring these low-level drug offenders to jail. And she's implemented a version of that now in Houston for at least marijuana cases where they're dealt with at the police substation and can do 8 hours of community service or treatment program for 8 hours, a drug education program, and then it's dismissed and they never have a charge, nothing on their record. So, I think there is a lot of movement, and frankly, you've seen it in juvenile justice. I mean, there's many district attorneys and prosecutors who have done very forward-thinking things on juvenile justice, and perhaps not coincidentally, we've seen a 40% drop in juvenile incarceration just over the last 15 years. And if we could just replicate some of the things from the juvenile system and the adult system, I think you'd see a tremendous change. And part of that is, obviously, a lot of district attorneys, they realize that the juveniles they're not fully developed in their cognitive abilities, and also that, frankly, the data has shown that sending them to these remotely located lockups actually, in most cases, does more harm than good. So I'm optimistic that we can continue to make headway with prosecutors, but I also think that certainly it's important for legislators to realize that just because a prosecutor takes a certain position, and frankly, a lot of times on something like sentencing reform, we've heard from some of the major metropolitan areas that the reason that they want the highest maximum sentence is not because they want to seek that, but because it enables them to, in their view, to plea out cases quickly. So, for example, John Chisholm in Milwaukee has said, well, maybe if I have another prosecutor, including some of these community-oriented prosecutors that are working in certain neighborhoods, that that would be a better use of money, and I can actually look at these cases on an individual basis more so than just trying to plea them out so quickly. So I think we need to move from kind of the assembly line, pleading these cases out quickly, using the leverage of these long sentences or possible mandatory minimums. When you get so many mandatory minimums for all these different offenses, the prosecutor effectively picks the sentence by picking the charge. So that's part of this concentration of power in the prosecutor that we need to help roll back. And obviously it's difficult for anybody with a tremendous amount of power to give up some of that, but I think you're seeing encouraging signs.
Well, we could go on for hours and hours, so I want to thank the Brennan Center again for hosting us, thank our panel, also acknowledge and thank the online audience, which was fairly significant for this event. And just as a reminder, as we do go through the political cycle and you want to keep track of what's going on both at the state level and at the national level, you'll want to watch the Brennan Center's Justice website and the Political Forum program at New America, where we will be tracking all of these issues and, of course, everything written by Jamel and Mark going forward. So thank you all again very much, and let's thank the panel. This is where I'm always afraid that the mic is still on.